A 25-year-old cold case may be solved as investigators charge a man with the murder of Angie Housman.
The 9-year-old was abducted, tortured, and later found dead in the Bush Wildlife Area in 1993. Prosecutors say they never stopped working the case, and their persistence finally paid off. The I-Team's PJ Randawa is live with more about who investigators say is the killer. PJ?
Well, it's important to note evidence in this case was tested and retested over the years, but it was at the end of February when that testing finally paid off. Investigators were able to get a sample of DNA off a little piece of Angie's underwear. Now, that DNA led them to a suspect. That's 61-year-old Earl Webster Cox. Now, Cox has a long history of sexually abusing children. He's currently incarcerated in a North Carolina federal prison for peddling thousands of images of child pornography. He's from the St. Louis area, and he was living near Angie at the time of her murder. But prosecutors also believe there may be other people involved in the murder. One person who hasn't been ruled out as of today is Ron Bone, Angie's stepfather. He spoke with us earlier today.
Then he actually over to that hammer slaps down and said he's guilty. You know, it still gets slapped down and say, hey, he's not guilty. Kill him. You ain't gotta worry about him anymore.
He deserves the death penalty, and he deserves it tomorrow. He doesn't deserve to live what he did to that little girl. She was sweet and innocent. Horrible.
Now, Cox also has ties to the Ferguson and Overland areas, and we're hearing he may be charged for sex crimes in those areas as well, dating back to the late 80s and early 90s. He is currently in North Carolina, as I mentioned, in a federal prison, and he'll be coming back to Missouri in the next couple of weeks to answer for these charges. Reporting in St. Charles County, PJ Randawa, 5 on your side.
The disappearance of Angie Housman shook the bi-state to its core. Just 10 days earlier, another young girl had gone missing in Maryland Heights. So when Angie disappeared somewhere between her home and her school bus stop a half block away, St. Anne police brought out helicopters and dogs to search and quickly called it an abduction. It was November 18, 1993. 9-year-old Angie Housman got off the school bus at the corner of St. Charles Rock Road and Wright. She headed home just 8 houses away. When word of the little girl's disappearance spread, members of the Major Case Squad were activated, fielding hundreds of tips generated by this sketch. It shows a man seen in the neighborhood both before and after Angie's murder. But none of those leads panned out. 9 days into the investigation and 2 days after Thanksgiving, hunters in St. Charles County found Angie's body in a remote ravine in the Bush Wildlife Area.
They found her tied to a tree. She still had the duct tape across her eyes and her mouth.
Investigators inside the St. Charles County Crime Lab processed 150 pieces of evidence, painstaking work. They even had the gaffer's tape that bound Angie's body. Parts of the puzzle became more clear.
She was tortured.
And on Thanksgiving Day, when most everyone else was home with family, the killer brought Angie here.
She was taken in there alive and tied to a tree, mostly naked.
Pink, red, and white flowers decorated Angie's casket at her funeral. Mourners held balloons at her burial and talked about the many lives she touched in her short life. And even though there would be no prom, wedding day, or children for Angie herself, one friend said she was filled with hope.
That there is a God up above and justice will be done.
At the end of the service, the clouds parted and the sun came out, bringing more tears. One family member said it was a sign Angie was at peace. But there would be no peace for family, friends, and investigators who only want justice for Angie.
If we can't get him here, then he'll get his in the hereafter.
Not only was the community deeply shaken, dozens of seasoned investigators and detectives with the Major Case Squad who worked that case said the crime took its toll on them and left them with a sick feeling.
Good afternoon. I'm Casey Nolan. We're coming on with breaking news this afternoon. St. Charles County prosecutors in the next few minutes are expected to announce charges in the Angie Housman murder case. Angie was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered when she was just 9 years old back in 1993. A case that shocked the St. Louis area, to say the least. On Monday, I-Team investigator PJ Randawa reported exclusive information about a person of interest in this 26-year-old murder. We learned more about the possible suspect yesterday. St. Charles County Prosecuting Attorney Tim Lohmar is about to speak now. Let's go to St. Charles County.
We're all here. I want to make a few introductions. First of all, I would like to introduce Chief Dave Todd, Chief of the St. Charles County Police Department, Chief Aaron Jimenez, Chief of the St. Anne Police Department. We have representatives of the Major Case Squad, Dan DeCarly. Dan, where are you? Right over there. Thank you, sir. These are the three major contributors to the investigation over the last 25 plus years, along with the FBI, which unfortunately they don't have anybody who can join us today. I also would like to point out former Sheriff Tom Neer to my right, and Peggy Neer, who was the former lieutenant in charge of the crime lab. She was crucial and instrumental in gathering and maintaining all the evidence over many, many years. As you all know, we are here today to talk about some answers to a question that many of us in this region, many of us in this room in particular, have had over the last 25 plus years, and that is what happened to Angie Housman. Today is a day I think that many of us have been waiting for. Didn't know if we'd ever get here, but we are here, and we are pleased to announce that we have a suspect, and we have formally charged an individual with the murder, abduction, and sexual assault of Angie Housman. This case is unique in many ways because it captured the attention of so many of us who grew up here, including myself, so many of us who were involved in the law enforcement community at the time, and just so many people who lived in this region who were frightened and terrified that something of this magnitude could happen to a child in our community. And this is one of those cases that in talking to some of the guys, there's some people up here, Ed Copeland in particular. Ed has been, he was one of the first responders to the crime scene. Ed has been involved in this case from day one, and he's never let this thing go. Ed has told me he's lost sleep at night over this case for many years and didn't know what he'd do with himself if this case never got resolved. So it's for people like Ed and so many other people who, I'm afraid if I start to mention names, I'll leave somebody out. This is why we're happy to be here. This is why we're proud to be here. It's a sad occasion. We are remembering something that was a terrible, terrible tragedy to a young lady who didn't deserve this. But at the same time, today culminates so much effort, so much work, so much passion and dedication. And it's something I think that we as a community can be very, very proud of. It's been some time that since this has happened, obviously 25 plus years, excuse me. So I'd like to briefly review with you the details of the case. Now keep in mind, I want to be as transparent as possible, but at the same time, I have a responsibility and a duty to do everything I can to protect the defendant's right to a fair trial. So hopefully you understand that and respect that there's just certain things I can't get into at this time. But again, I'll try to share as much as I can. Back on November 18th, 1993, that was a Thursday afternoon, about 4 p.m., the school bus had just let out. That was the last time Angie Housman was seen alive. She did not return home from the school bus at the normal time. She wasn't seen early in the evening. She wasn't seen later in the evening. And it was a few hours into that we realized that we had a crime scene on our hands. Several days passed. As I just referenced, the community was in a panic. Law enforcement personnel, dozens upon dozens, if not hundreds, mobilized along with community volunteers, scoured the area, combed the area, talked to every possible witness they could talk to no avail. Sadly, on November 27th, 1993, which was about 9 days later, at about 10:45 in the morning, which was a Saturday morning, Angie's body was found by a hunter in the August A. Bush wildlife area off South 94 here in St. Charles County. Angie's nude body was found partially covered with snow. Her head was wrapped in duct tape, except for her nose. Her hands were handcuffed behind her back, and her left arm was bound to a tree. There were deep lacerations to both her left and her right wrist, and also to her right thigh. The duct tape around her wrist appeared to have been put there so as to slow the bleeding. Crime scene evidence revealed that Angie had suffered from a significant violent sexual assault. Crime scene evidence further indicated that Angie was alive as she was bound and left in the woods, and that she struggled extensively to free herself before she ultimately perished. Overnight, just hours before her body was discovered, temperatures were below freezing. Among many other things found at the crime scene, under the tape covering Angie's mouth was a torn piece of her underpants. It was used as a gag in her mouth. Near her body, in a Dollar General store bag, police found 2 additional torn pieces of the same underwear. These underwear were distinctive because they had a Barbie logo. An autopsy performed by Dr. Mary Case just a day after Angie's body was discovered concluded that Angie had been violently sexually assaulted in addition to the above described injuries. She was found to be malnourished, dehydrated, and appeared to have been tortured. The official cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. After years and years of investigation, after hundreds, if not thousands, of leads that many of these people up here had to track down each and every one of them, sometimes coming hundreds at a time. Finally, on February 27th of this year, Brian Cry, who's the senior forensic scientist with the St. Charles County Crime Lab, and Brian is up here. Brian's right there. Great work, by the way, Brian. Brian notified the lead detective, Ed Copeland, that he had analyzed the pink trim on 2 of the torn pieces of the victim's underpants that were found at the crime scene. Near the spot where one of the pieces had been torn, Brian found DNA consistent with a mixture of 2 individuals, the victim, Angie Housman, and an individual by the name of Earl Webster Cox. Cox was initially identified through CODIS, and his DNA was then collected with his consent, and it was retested. Cox was the major contributor of DNA at the location tested. For the portion consistent with Cox's DNA, only 1 in 58.1 trillion unrelated individuals selected at random could be expected to have the same profile. The entire population on Earth is only 7.53 billion. So multiply the Earth's population times 8,000, and that's the likelihood that we'd find another individual that matches this DNA profile, the same as Earl W. Cox. A background investigation of Earl Cox revealed that in 1975, Cox enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, and in 1982, Cox was dishonorably discharged due to multiple sex offenses involving 4 juveniles while on assignment in Germany. As a result of this, Cox was court-martialed and was sentenced to 8 years, which he served in the Leavenworth Federal Prison. In 1985, Cox was released from federal custody and placed on federal parole. In 1988, Cox transferred his federal parole supervision to Missouri, where he lived in the 3400 block of Wismer Avenue in Breckenridge Hills, Missouri. It should be noted that this address is approximately a quarter mile from where Angie was abducted. In December of 1992, after a series of parole violations, Cox was ultimately released again from Leavenworth Prison, and he moved back to the St. Anne, Missouri area. From 1993 to 1995, we know that Cox lived on Dade Avenue in Ferguson, Missouri. It should also be noted that Cox had family members who lived very near to 2900 Lesmer, in the 2900 block of Lesmer Avenue in Overland, Missouri, from 1992 until the mid-1990s. The Lesmer address is significant because it just happens to be 3 residences to the east of Booter Elementary School, which is the school where Angie attended, and approximately 0.8 miles from where Angie was last seen. As a result of all of that, today my office has charged Earl W. Cox with murder in the first degree, kidnapping in the first degree, and sodomy. Earl Cox is currently a patient in a federal medical facility located in North Carolina. He is there as a result of a civil commitment proceeding that came after a sentence he served in a child pornography ring that was prosecuted federally out of the state of Colorado. The key in this case, obviously, is the DNA evidence. And I cannot emphasize enough the dedication and brilliance of the St. Charles County Crime Lab in basically solving this crime. And that's not to diminish the work that anybody else who was involved in this investigation did. We had numerous crime labs involved. We had the Missouri State Highway Patrol, we had St. Louis County Crime Lab, we had the FBI over the years. Now, as you can imagine, we're sitting here in 2019. The advancements in DNA technology are staggering compared to what we had in its initial stages. In fact, the evidence was never DNA tested until approximately 2004. And I say that because the advancements in technology up till 2004 really wouldn't have revealed any sort of significant DNA evidence. What made this particular case such a challenge for our crime lab professionals were several things. I want to try to list those. First of all, the age of the samples, the evidence that was tested. Many years had passed before the DNA processing began. There's a process in the DNA world known as degradation, which means the longer the time passes since the DNA may have transferred to an object that's tested, the more likelihood that that DNA is no longer detectable. In addition, as you can imagine, we had dozens, if not hundreds, of individuals involved in investigating this case, handling evidence, going to various departments, various criminal laboratories to be tested. There were many, many individuals involved and multiple labs involved. Every single time a test is performed, it makes it that much more difficult for any item to be retested again. In other words, you've used up whatever may have been there, so you can't go back and retest. In addition, there was a development in approximately 2017, which really was a game changer for us. Prior to that time, an item of clothing, for example, that was DNA tested, if it had any sort of dye in it, a dye acted as an inhibitor, and it called for an inconsistent or inconclusive DNA result. The items tested, in this case in particular, the underpants that we reference, there was this piece right here. That actually is the piece that was tested that resulted in the DNA hit that I've just described. You can see its pink color. That's the dye from the trim of her underpants. The breakthrough in technology that came about in 2017 allowed these folks to test this object and not have the dye act as an inhibitor. So that was a huge breakthrough for us. And on top of that, these guys, it's a 3-person lab. They have thousands and thousands of evidentiary items to test each and every day. They've got a caseload that's just like all of us in public service. We wish we had more manpower and more resources, but they're limited, and so they do the best that they can with what they have. This was a cold case. That doesn't mean it was a dead case. It just means it wasn't on an active track the same way that other cases may be. So you've put all those factors together, and that helps explain why we got where we are. Now, I will tell you this. The fact that it took this long for us to be able to use the current technology and do the DNA testing, which gave us the result that we have, that was a blessing in disguise. Had we tested this particular item any sooner than we did, there's a very good chance that nothing would have come about because the technology wasn't advanced enough, and that piece of evidence would have just been put back in its place, and we move on to the next piece, and it never would have been retested. In talking to Brian Hampton, the St. Charles County Crime Lab Director, Brian said to me, and I thought it was great, and I wrote this down, he said he talks to his team about the 3 T's, in particular in this case: technology, tenacity, and time. And that's the motto that these guys use, and that got us to where we needed to be. So this case, it's about much, much more than just the DNA analysis. But in particular, the finding that was the linchpin for us was good science, good lab work, and just good luck. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. It's not like on TV or CSI where something goes to the crime lab and within a few minutes they find a DNA sample. It's much more tedious than that. Without bodily fluid such as blood or seminal fluid, there's no way to know where DNA may exist on a particular item. And so that's why it's literally like looking for a needle in a haystack. And Brian and I joked about this earlier this morning. They were looking for a needle in a haystack without a magnet, but they still found the needle. I just want to wrap up this portion before we entertain questions and just, again, recognize so many people, more than just the people that are standing up here, although these people were crucial in their leadership in the investigation from the very beginning to the present. There were so many people involved, so much blood, sweat, and tears. And obviously we grieve for the little girl. She's the reason we're here, and she never deserved this, and she suffered a fate that no one should ever suffer. And without the dogged pursuit and the dedication of these men and those others who are not here, and women who I have the privilege of speaking on behalf of, we wouldn't be here today. So with that, again, understanding that I'm very limited in what I can say, I will entertain questions. Yes, ma'am.
Has Earl Cox confessed, and are you going to seek the death penalty?
Right out of the gate.
You've been listening to St. Charles County Prosecutor Tim Lohmar officially announcing what we first reported earlier this week when our PJ Rendawa broke the news that there was a suspect in the nearly 30-year-old murder case of 9-year-old Angie Housman, who was abducted, tortured, and killed, and then found in St. Charles County back in 1993. Tim Lohmar officially announcing charges against Earl Webster Cox, a man he says is currently a patient, a federal patient under a civil commitment in another state. You heard him say there, the investigators had been looking for a needle in a haystack without a magnet, and they still found it. Some of the details, if you've been with us since we came on the air, it's almost hard to even recount, but it shows you just how shocking, why, as the prosecutor said, for those of us who were here in 1993, he described it. He said that the community was frightened and terrified, and then he also said investigators lost sleep for many years trying to solve this case. So for those of us who were here and for those of us who weren't, you understand just what a shocking situation, what a horrible, almost unspeakable situation. Angie was found 9 days after she was last seen getting off a school bus in St. Anne. She was found 9 days later by a hunter, partially covered in the snow with signs and evidence that she had been tortured and left alive, bound to a tree. Now here, almost 26 years later, prosecutors say they have the man who did it. We're going to step away right now, and we will be back at 4 o'clock with much more on this case and the rest of the day's news.
I mean, it's certainly possible. The profile of your typical sex offender is that there are multiple victims. I'm not saying that's attributable to Mr. Cox, although his own history has shown that he's been prone to this behavior in the past. We don't have any specific information at this time that would lead us to believe that he has perpetrated on any other individuals.
Will he be brought back to Missouri at any point?
He will be. So he's in a federal facility. There's a little bit of a process we got to go through, an extradition process, but we expect to get him back here within the next few weeks.
Now, Ron Bone has told some of us in the media that he was considered a suspect in this case. Is he involved in this at all?
Here's what I can tell you. We have reason to believe that Earl W. Cox was not the only suspect involved in this case. And I'm not going to get into too much detail on that. I just can't. We do believe that it's very possible another person was involved. At this point, until we have more information, nobody can be eliminated as a suspect. So I'll just leave it at that.
So there could be more arrests?
There could be.
In the charging documents, there is a mention of a case in Overland. Do you expect, and I know we're talking St. Charles County here, but are you working with St. Louis County in terms of other charges against Earl Cox for other incidents in our area?
That's a difficult question for me to answer, but I'll try to do my best. During the course of the investigation, our two investigators, John and Ed, contacted one of the individuals who was allegedly assaulted in 1989 in Oberlin. In the course of their discussion, other details emerged about an additional sexual assault that took place over a significant period of time in St. Louis County's jurisdiction. She lives out of state. She's obviously an adult now. She's indicated her willingness to cooperate if charges were pursued. That is up to Wesley Bell's office, but I know that our investigative team has spoken with him, and they're expecting to receive a warrant application at some point here in the near future on those charges as well.
Do we know what happened with those Oberlin charges and why they were dismissed or dropped? Why he wasn't, in 1993 behind bars?
Yeah, we don't know for sure. We've got some insight into it. A couple of things were at play. You had very young victims, very, very young victims. When I say very young, I mean single digits. Their ability to participate and cooperate in the investigation. We didn't have the tools in place back then that we do now. Some of the services like the forensic interview team, things like that, to help a child's testimony go through the entire court proceeding. So for a variety of reasons, the determination was made by, I guess it was Buzz Westfall's administration, that those charges wouldn't be pursued. And unfortunately, that's a reality even today. Those things happen. I can't speak to the specifics of why that was.
Do you find it interesting that this group of mothers, Angie's Angels, have been involved in this case as far as keeping it, in the public eye, but the family really hasn't? Do you find that interesting?
I can tell you about Angie's Angels. I can appreciate their passion, and I'm sure their heart is in a good place, but in terms of being any assistance in the investigation, all they did for us is leave nasty messages on our social media telling us that we weren't doing our job. So that wasn't real helpful. So I don't have much of an opinion besides that.
So they didn't have any role in this DNA being retested in February of this year, and leading to this?
No, and for anybody to claim otherwise, that's ludicrous. I'll tell you what it was. It's the people up here, these two guys in particular who led the investigation from St. Anne, St. Charles County. These guys were there from day one. It was their passion, their dedication that inspired the rest of us to keep this going. We got together back in 2013, and we developed a new task force. I think it was the third task force since the inception of this case. And it was John Langford and Ed Copeland who spoke most passionately and said, guys, we got to figure this out. There's got to be an answer. We got to get this done. That is what pushed us across the finish line, nothing else.
You mentioned a DNA, an overload in the, in the crime lab. Can you talk to how that does make cases like this difficult and other cold cases in our area to solve? I mean, are there more resources that are needed?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in a perfect world, I think Brian would love to have a staff that's quadruple the size that he has now, but he doesn't, and he's got two of the finest guys you could have working in this lab. But yes, there are limitations. The human element, we can only do so much. I can tell you, the DNA testing in just this case alone, the amount of, the number of pieces of evidence that was tested and the number of times it was tested, the samples that were tested, is staggering compared to your average case where DNA testing is crucial in the evidentiary phase. But it is an issue for us. I think other cold cases are going to be solved through DNA, especially as technology advances, and especially as we get good stories like this. It inspires those of us who are in this industry who have our own cases, work even harder on those cases to try to find an answer.
Tim, could Ed and John maybe speak to how personal this has been for them and to stick with this case for 25 years and to try to solve it? They tried before Angie's mother passed away. Could they speak from the personal aspect of this?
There are so many people I think that would like to speak, and we've talked collectively from an ethical standpoint. Now that this case is in prosecution mode, anything that's said publicly is attributable to our prosecution. So I have asked them to allow me to speak on their behalf, and they've graciously agreed to let me do that. What I can tell you is, and again, I'll never do it the justice that these guys can do it. I've worked closely with them, especially over the last 3 months. We've talked probably on a weekly basis. We've met on a bi-weekly basis, and just the passion that they've displayed, the dogged determination.
heard by the investigator on February 27th of this year or the following, or?
2019, just a few months ago.
Okay, I'm kind of confused because I heard back in November from law enforcement that there was going to be DNA testing, or maybe it was December, so.
There are some other items of evidence that the FBI lab has in Virginia that they're still testing for us. They have some mitochondrial DNA testing that they're performing for us that we just can't do here on the local level. That's in process right now, so I'm assuming that's what you're referring to.
Oh, okay, so that's.
Yeah, that's not what we're talking about here. Yeah.
Okay.
Tim, congratulations, first of all. I'm a little confused. I'm going to go back to the stepfather, the Ron Bone. Were you indicating he might be a person of interest at this point as another one of the possible suspects?
He can't be eliminated at this point, I can tell you that.
Is there any connection or association between him and Earl Cox?
That's a question I wish I had an answer to. I think that now that we are public with the suspect, not a suspect, a defendant who's being charged with these crimes, I anticipate, as do our investigators, that we're going to get several more leads that might draw a connection between Earl Cox and someone close to Angie. We don't have that information now. What we know now is that other than being in a physical proximity of where Angie not only lived, but where she was abducted, there's no direct connection between Earl Cox and the Housman family.
What would be the most beneficial thing that the public could offer your office at this point?
We've got the phone numbers up here, and if you can highlight those for us. Again, these guys have been entertaining thousands of leads over the years. But you know what? If it only takes one. So if somebody has any information, even if they think it's not useful, go ahead and make the call. We have enough evidence to prove Earl Cox is guilty in this case, in my humble opinion. But we also believe that there may be somebody else involved, and that's where we are really appealing to the public to step forward and give us any information that might be helpful.
Can you explain why you think there's another person involved? More directly, I guess.
No, but here's what I can do. Nice try, though. I don't want to dive into deep in the weeds on this. Let's just say this. The way the evidence unfolded at the crime scene, the way that she clearly was held for a period of time in a particular location and then transported to the woods, which was obviously another location, just some other things that we observed in the crime scene. When I say we, these guys and me later, of course, it would lead us to believe that he did not act alone. That doesn't mean that he didn't act alone. It just, there's a hunch from all these guys involved that there could possibly be another person involved.
Have you got DNA from somebody else at the crime scene that you'd like to identify?
There's other DNA samples out there. I'm not prepared to comment on it yet, but those are certainly places that give us a launching point for pursuing other leads.
I know you spoke to the Overland and the St. Louis County aspect, but this is a man who, looking at his case history, has clearly shown this pattern for a long time. Do you think that somewhere over the years that a ball was dropped in terms of getting this man off the streets for good?
That's a fair question. I understand why you'd ask that, and here's how I'm going to answer that. We are humans, and I would never question anyone's dedication or professionalism throughout the beginning to the end of this case. But when you do introduce the human element, there's always room for error. And it's easy for us to sit here and Monday morning quarterback and say, you know, if we would have done this, would have done that. The problem is, again, with manpower, you have to understand there were dozens and dozens of officers dedicated to this. But meanwhile, crime went on. Day-to-day crime kept going. That didn't stop. And so we didn't have the luxury of putting everything else on hold and pursuing every single exhaustive lead. I think under the circumstances, I would never question what the investigators did in this case. And again, human element is what it is. Sometimes we miss things.
I guess I meant less in terms of this department and this, but his previous crimes and the fact that he was court-martialed. There were crimes in Germany. His, record with the military. I mean, do you think that played any role in the fact that he was able to kind of get out and get back to our area?
Yeah, I mean, I think if the federal government could have locked him up for life, that would have been beneficial for us. We wouldn't be here today, but that's not how the system works. He's got rights the same way everybody else does. He served his sentence. He obtained his eligibility for parole, violated that parole, got paroled again. That's the way our system works. Unfortunately, you can't predict future behavior all the time as much as we'd like to think we could. But again, looking back, sure, it would have been great if he was locked up forever.
Let me ask one more question. Where were you
I like to keep it professional here, Kevin. No, it was disbelief. I think I got the call from my investigator, Mike Harvey, and Mike likes to yank my chain sometimes, and I thought maybe that's what he was doing, but he wasn't. And I think we met with these guys the next day. Wasn't it the next day? And they were ready for us to, charge him that day. We have a little more work to do, and we did that. But yeah, it was. For me, it was a feeling of great satisfaction, and I can only imagine for these guys, it was exuberance.
And because it's kind of a technical thing, did you have to look through the microscope yourself or look at some technical stuff before you were convinced it was true?
No, I just looked at the reports. These guys prepare these reports in in certain formats, so I trust their good work.
Do you know anything about how perhaps communication has improved that might have back then given police a reason to look at him more closely when this first happened, given his previous history and his affiliation with the area and that sort of thing? Was there anything that has changed since then that now they would have been able to close in on someone like this more closely?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a database called MIAC, which is a website and service that all of the local law enforcement folks.
This case may have been out of the public's eye for a long while, yet two professional law enforcement officers, St. Anne Lieutenant Colonel John Langford and St. Charles County Detective Lieutenant Ed Copeland, have worked for almost 26 years, never having lost focus in bringing justice in the Angie Housman case. They have worked tirelessly to pursue the thousands of leads that came as a result of the disappearance and subsequent death of a 9-year-old Angie Housman. I can't thank both of these men enough for their dedication. This case was originally worked by retired Sheriff Neer, Chief Dave Todd, Dan DeCarly, including members of the Major Case Squad under the direction of then Detective Bob Lowry. There were officers from multiple municipalities who worked together for thousands of hours, including St. Anne Sergeant John Chico Lee and Lieutenant John Roney and others who are no longer with us. Under the leadership of retired Chief Bob Schrader, who has carried the burden, including many sleepless nights, of losing one of our own children, the work that was done has proven to be beneficial, and we extend our thanks to all of them. Thank you. Extreme thanks to Tim Lohmar and St. Charles County Prosecuting Attorney's Office for handling the case. We anticipate the prosecution process will also take time, yet I am also confident that under Tim Lohmar's leadership, justice will be served. Thank you also to the entire St. Charles County Police Department, especially their criminalistics laboratory, for their willingness to use new technology to retest the items found at the scene for DNA. I also want to thank the St. Louis FBI office under the leadership of Special Agent in Charge Richard Quinn and Assistant SAC Alicia Corder, along with multiple other FBI agents who have been crucial in part of this investigation. Thank you to the Rittner School District and Superintendent Dr. Chris Kilbride, who in addition to past superintendents gave their support through this investigation. I also want to thank St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney Wesley Bell and his office for what we anticipate will be additional charges against the suspect for other victims. Thank you to the residents of City of St. Anne and surrounding communities and their residents. This case has long-reaching impact on many families. We appreciate your continuous support while the legal system finds justice in this case. Often, the men and women of law enforcement involved in these types of horrific crimes spend the rest of their lives remembering the victims. The investigators who have worked this case and others who have and are working other violent cases have never forgotten their oaths to speak on behalf of those who could no longer speak for themselves. I would also like to take this opportunity to ask all parents, educators, and law enforcement officers to take time out of their busy schedules to have conversations with your children about personal safety and remind them that if they experience something that makes them feel uncomfortable, to tell the trusted adult. We are hoping that by making an arrest in this case, the healing process may begin, and eventually St. Anne and all surrounding municipalities will find closure. Thank you.